We also think that probably a lot of young children are the ones who are likely to take this confessional very seriously. We think that on the other side, we think that very hardcore criminals are not necessarily going to these confessionals, right? And we think that even if they do, we think that probably they don't, if they go to church and partake in these religious institutions, they are not necessarily going to confessionals, right? But what do we think is confessed in these situations, and what does this exactly look like? We think that a big portion of these crimes are things that are kind of have been done to you, right? Or have happened in your family, things that probably are hurting you personally, right? So for example, if it is a younger individual, a younger child, probably this is an instance where they are more likely to tell about things such as instances of sexual abuse. We think that this is probably going to be things where an elderly person has kind of been part of this family drama and someone has, let's say, harmed another person, and these are the kind of things that are confessed. Now, we think that these are nonetheless kind of serious things, but we think that specifically they are likely to be things that have been done to you, and rather than kind of things that have been, let's say, that you have done, let's say, specifically because the people who are in church are likely to be these very vulnerable individuals. Now, how does this go to our principle? So basically, we value the kind of harm to the individual in the case that it exists less than the kind of thing that happens on a societal level. So what does this mean? We are willing to trade off if someone as a criminal commits something bad, we are, let's say, we are willing to trade that off for the fact that they are caught, and probably many people in society are kind of benefited from this. But some characterization as to what we mean by serious crimes. We think that serious crimes are things such as, you know, sexual assaults, things like murder, things like kind of aggressive assaults, things that harm another person very directly. Now, we think that principally this is analogous to what healthcare workers go through, right? So specifically, healthcare workers have a duty to protect patient secrecy, except at the point where it is very serious crimes as well, right? So for example, if a patient tells them that they have been sexually assaulted, in a lot of countries such as Finland, it is the kind of duty of that healthcare worker to tell that to the police, because it is more important to kind of save that person or to kind of stop this crime rather than to, you know, preserve this patient secrecy, right? And so we think that in principle, this is a similar case whereby basically, even if there is, let's say, a breach of trust or another thing, that is less important than the harm in society that is occurring. So basically, the assault or other such thing. So we think that this is principally just. But secondly, we think that basically this will lead to less crimes in general. Now, we don't think that this will necessarily be a huge amount of crimes, but we think that it will be some very serious crimes that will not have come about specifically otherwise, right? So for example, in the case of a kind of vulnerable child who is facing a sexual abuse situation where they do not have anyone else to turn to, or they do not understand the situation, but they are brought up in a religious household and therefore they believe that the priest is someone they can truly talk to, right? We think that in this instance, it is more likely that... Yes.
You do know that today priests are allowed to give this information to the police. The change is that tomorrow the police will have the opportunity to subpoena them and to make them testify in cases.
So we think that yes, having priests basically in the court system can be a kind of positive thing, and we think that specifically if in the status quo the priest is not going to the police in these kind of serious cases, then it is important to give them this kind of push to do so, right? So probably in the status quo, they are less likely to always tell the police about these cases due to the fact that they feel that it is their kind of religious duty to not do so, or they feel that they owe this kind of oath of secrecy to this individual they have heard this confession from. However, at the point where basically they report this crime to the police, we think that this creates less of the crime in general, in society, right? And so for the individual who has reported or told this crime to the priest, we think that in general, especially at the point where it is a crime that has been done to them, it is specifically beneficial that this is brought to the police, because at this point, the police, now that they're being made aware of a crime that they did not previously know was going on, they're more likely to kind of try to figure out this case and try to find who is responsible and so forth, and to bring them to justice. And we think that this is a net good. I have not been timing myself. I assume that my time is up, so thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech and call on the Leader of Opposition to open the case for the opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Give me one sec. Don't know where to put those. Okay. Two things in this speech. Firstly, why we think that principally this is wrong and why we protect religious freedom on our side of the house, why that is important. And secondly, why this makes bad criminals worse, why crime gets worse, why all the practical benefits that proposition want to bring you don't actually happen, and in fact become so much worse on their side of the house. First bit of like fiat rebuttal / framing, right? Who are we talking about when we're talking about this? Probably not organized crime, because they will have their own crooked priests who would never report to the cops anyway. And aside from that, probably one-off criminals who go because they feel they need to confess what sin they believe will stop them going from hell, what sin they believe will resolve them from moral damnation by their religion and by their community. People that are looking for help, and because they trust the priest, go and confess that crime to them under the status quo. So what happens when you now make these priests in cahoots with the police? Note, the police are seen as pretty bad in the vast majority of the communities and where this will probably take place. It means you get fewer people confessing, and so on and so forth. So why do people confess? We tell you they confess, and that it is fundamental tenet of some religions is confession, right? We're going to like say that the healthcare worker analogy that opposition bring you is like incorrect, right? We tell you that like the healthcare professional is not protecting a person beyond like their physical health. They are not protecting them from others. Rather, we tell you that it's more analogous to someone like a lawyer, right? In that the lawyer is there to protect their client from others and to defend their physical body from any harm, in that they do not want them to go to jail. That is why you have client confidentiality with a lawyer. That is why someone can say, I did the crime, but I don't want to go to jail. Please help me plead not guilty. How can we best do this? Note that a priest is exactly the same, in that the only difference is that they are protecting not the physical body, but the spiritual body of the person. We tell you that in a world where we have client confidentiality with a lawyer, you also have to have confessional confidentiality with a priest, because the priest is going one higher and protecting your spirit from actually going to hell. It's an important freedom in its own right, and we don't think it's enough for them to say, but in some bad cases, right, like doctors go and tell the police about stuff. Notice, again, we think that like priests also do that in like cases where they are scared for the person, but they don't do it because they are forced by some alternative external party. We don't see why this is okay. It constitutes an attack on confidentiality, which is so absolutely right. So why do people confess, and what are the practical benefits of this terrible like thing that they're about to do? Okay, people confess because they know about this confidentiality, because they feel that they can trust the priest, because they can trust the priest, because they can go without fear of reprisal, in that they want help, right? They want to go to someone who they know will only tell others if they absolutely have to, and that they trust this pastor who is in most cases a pillar of the community. Because we think that the vast majority of people who are going to be doing these crimes confessing are people who are vulnerable and from poorer backgrounds, and it is that reason that they have this pillar of community. So why don't they go to the police, right? They don't go to the police because they fear they are to blame. When you've been brought up in a very religious family and you are told by your parents that sexual abuse is a normalcy, you don't go to the police because you fear that you are to blame. Second, we tell you that they don't go because they are scared of consequences when they have committed a crime, right? When they have siege mindset, it means they don't want to go to the police because the police are seen as evil in the areas where we want this thing to work out. Because of things like police brutality against ethnic minorities, because family members and friends are more likely to have been arrested, the police now control organized religion. And now where that area was confidential and where that area did become somewhere you could go to confess and absolve yourself of something that you could change, it now goes away. It means that you are less likely to have people go, and that is a really, really bad thing. Not only because it takes down all of proposition stuff where they tell you, but people will go and confess, because we don't see why they will. But secondarily, we tell you that it gets rid of some of the very important mechanisms by which we avert crime in the first place, right? Second point of substantive practicality. Why this makes bad criminals worse and why there is more crime if you introduce this policy. We tell you that like many criminals are religious because most people in the world are religious, and just statistically it is the case, right? That some of them will have red lines based on morality. Note that when someone commits an act that they think is wrong, they do not immediately go to the police because sometimes they are terrified of being arrested. Instead, we tell you that they probably seek out pillars of their community, family, friends, and in most likely cases, religion, right? The point at which they no longer trust the religion is the point at which they no longer go there. And when they say that organized religion is actively working against them because there's now an association that that person will go to the police, right, is the point at which they will no longer go there and they will no longer trust religion as a whole. It means what few red lines the hardened criminals had probably go away, which means you have worse crime. But secondly, we tell you that for many criminals, religion allows rehabilitation, right? They are terrified of going to the police because they are scared of going to jail and they're scared of what happens, right? But we tell you that when they go to the priest and they ask for help, the priest will make them realize what is wrong and realize why that is something they have to be absolved. When they go to the priest and they say, "Forgive me, Father, for I have done X, Y, Z," the priest then tells them, "You have done that, that's really bad. You ought to confess. As a moral obligation, you have to confess as that." Note that when someone is likely to understand the fact that they have to confess as a religious point of view, they are first much more likely to do so, but second, much more okay with the outcome. They are much more likely to be rehabilitated after coming out of prison because they feel they have served their time for what they did, right? Third point of practicality. We tell you that religion stops people going down the wrong path. Notice that in these areas where we think this is most important, these people are often forced into crime because they have no other choice. Maybe they have to support their family members. Maybe they have gangs operating in their territory and they are told this is the only way. Notice that a religion in or outside of that community is a means by which a priest can tell them, you have an alternative. You don't have to go down this path. You can go and volunteer in somewhere else. You can become a missionary. You can help around the church. I can help you get a job. When you implement this law, you remove that because you now associate the religious organization with the very body that they hate, with the very body that the gangs are telling them they have to join up in order to avoid. As a young, vulnerable person who feels they have made a mistake in committing a violent crime or a serious crime, and then they go to the priest and they realize, I can't actually talk about this, they are far more likely to go to the other pillar of community, which is crime in their area. It means they are more likely to commit and they're never given any alternative. They become serial criminals, which we think is a higher proportion of them become serial criminals when they were in actuality just vulnerable people that needed help. When you implement this policy, you take away the pillar of community, which is so important to religion, you harm religious freedom, and you gate more crime. Great proposition.
Thank the speaker for their comments, and now call on the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the government bench. Here. Woo.
Honourable Speaker, let's be very sort of explicit about what's occurred here in the opening half. We've both accepted the status quo is that priests are at liberty to report any crimes they hear in confession. Now that we are taking this baseline as the status quo, it's been accepted by both of the first speakers. This is what we are now debating in. So this is the status quo insofar as the debate is concerned. And it makes sense. If that wasn't the status quo, we'd have gigantically more crimes of very serious consequence that would not be reported at all. So therefore, this becomes a question of whether it's better that the priest has a degree of, is making the decision as to whether they want to report it or whether they don't want to report it. And that is the prerogative of the priest. Therefore, we've already essentially destroyed any semblance of a protected client sort of relationship that we might have with a lawyer or whatever, right? So now that we have we've dealt with now this being as it is, the sanctity of religion in that sense has already been fatally undermined in the status quo, because where they can bring a case to the police, the vast majority of people who would not confess for fear of being reported are not confessing in the status quo anyway, simply because of the possibility that they will be reported, right? If you have been around in gangs or whatever, and you have this view of the justice system as something that's kind of going out to get you, you're likely to have that kind of a view of organized religion as well. In fact, you're likely to have that kind of view of the world outside of your gang as a whole. So we don't think that this sort of idea makes a lot of sense. And also just on the kind of idea that the priest is somehow at a special place in protecting your spiritual body, and how this is, you know, an even higher calling than doctor or whatever. Look, the judicial system can do a lot of things, but it cannot condemn your spirit to hell, right? So therefore, there is no sense in which the priest reporting you to the police is in any sense a religious disservice to you. It's not going to cause any religious or kind of spiritual harm to you, even within that belief system, right? Because the court cannot cause spiritual consequences. So therefore, we don't think that this is in any sense kind of in contradiction with the priest's spiritual role with the parishioner, right? So why do we think it is then so important that we specifically have this be a mandatory thing rather than a voluntary kind of opt-in thing where the priest can do one way or the other? When it comes to things you've done, this might be your own crimes from longer ago or in the past. Think of a murderer coming towards the end of their own life and seeking forgiveness from the heavens. Or even something more recent. We think it's vitally important that someone else is not blamed for it. This alone, you know, can save some people from the death row, because old crimes can have people who are being punished for it decades later because they were wrongly convicted. Even if this is a small number of cases, we think that this all alone likely justifies the transition from the selective system towards a mandatory system, as far as all of the principal ideas against kind of religious sacrifice, the sanctimony of religion or whatever, are already conceded by the opposition by placing the status quo in the POI to be that it is something that they can do, right? So we and even furthermore, we also think that old cases being closed can finally bring a sense of certainty to the family of the victims, which again, large group of people around kind of are benefited in every individual case where something is reported, where in the status quo it might not be, because the priest might not think it's important enough to report, which is very likely to be the case if something is 20 years old or whatever. They may not consider the full consequences, or they might place the preference over the kind of their specific relationship with that particular parishioner or whatever. We don't want to risk it. We just want to do it in as absolute a way as possible, because there are clear benefits for every case that is reported, whereas for every case that kind of slips through the cracks is not going to bring us any benefit, because again, the benefits of having an elective versus a mandatory system are so slight in any case. Even if you just discounted all practical benefits, it would be a very slight kind of change when it comes to the elective versus mandatory system, right? So the current voluntary system is, wait a second. Okay, no, never mind. Right. So what is the case on our side? We basically, our case boils down to the simple fact that we think it's better, it's mandatory, than it is something that the priest can choose to do so or to not do so. Why? Because at the point at which it is mandatory, it's likely to happen more, because for all of the reasons, you know, around, a priest might choose not to report a crime because they have an old-fashioned view of religion themselves, where they hold some kind of religious sanctimony principle that doesn't in fact exist in the kind of practical minds of the criminals, right? At the point at which it's not a legal requirement, many priests are going to take the theological position that they want to protect the kind of sacred nature of religion or whatever, and therefore won't report anything they hear in confession. We believe this is likely to be a reasonably large group of priests. But where you make it mandatory, it's more, okay, I'll take Anna from CO.
Yeah, priests from which churches do you think, or which like religious institutions do you think will be summoned to be questioned or to testify more?
Okay, look, I don't think we are going to get to that level of analysis, simply because look, I have 1 minute, 15 seconds. I don't think it's reasonable in a debating context to start talking about the thousands of different religions that exist in the world. Let's just talk about religion in general as a spiritual system of belief in which some kind of confessionals happen, right? But never mind, right? So anyway, my point is, at the point at which it is a legal norm that you have to report it, you're likely to take that legal view, that legal norm is likely to go above any kind of intellectual theological position you might take, and therefore so we think substantially more priests will be compelled to report crimes that they are not currently reporting, because where it is voluntary, it is essentially a matter of opinion as to whether they should do so or not, but where it is legally required, it is a norm that they must follow, otherwise they may face some degree of consequences in the case where this confessional somehow becomes known, right? Potentially through the later confession to the police by the parishioner or whatever. So therefore, we think we get substantially more reports on our side of the house by making it mandatory than they do on their side of the house in the status quo. And we don't think that there's any great degree to which people are going to confess less or view religion differently, whether it's mandatory or whether it's voluntary. So therefore, I'm very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for their comments and call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Right, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Madam Speaker, when OG comes up and tells you that this motion does not amount to an imposition of religious freedom, I think they are being disingenuous. Because while they are telling the truth, when they say that it has no consequence on your spiritual afterlife, I think it's preventing people from being able to access a core tenet of their religion, from being and undermining the fundamental trust that they inherently want to place inside their priests, and it blocks them off and shuts people off from a legitimate avenue of advice, which people in desperate circumstances often need to defend their own interests. Even the worst of criminals needs someone in their corner at the end of the day. We think priests are very often the avenue to go. 3 things I'm going to talk about in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to rebut proposition's case about priests, about how they're going to confess to priests. Secondly, I'm going to talk about idea of choice. Thirdly, about religion. And lastly, I'm going to go into some ideas about rehabilitation and chilling effects. Firstly, I want to note here that in the entirety of government bench is propositioned on the assumption that there's a trust between the priest and the confessioner. Why is this the case? Because from the very outset of OG, they tell us that the reason that you go not to the police, but because of the priest, is because there is a level of trust. But I just want to note, how is that trust established, right? Isaac already gave you really convincing reasons why it's important to know that the priest is less likely to turn you in, or at the very least is not legally compelled to turn you in. And that's how it gets the talking process started, because you don't see them as a suspicious figure who's going to turn it in. I want to deal with the 2 subsections of their case, right? Firstly, let's talk about criminals who go to confession, right? Firstly, I think at the point at which they concede, at which it's a fundamental logic in their case, that if you tell the priest they must give you up to the police, then inherently people who tell priests under their status quo have already accepted the consequences of their actions and want to get retribution, right? Because they know that this is the logical corollary that will occur. I think that in our side of the world, if this person has already accepted the consequences, then they're still likely to go to the priest and confess, who at which point will tell them to go to the police. I'm not sure how this changes anything under their side, right? So what they need, the burden of proof they feel is telling us how, if it is a logical, the next logical step for someone to admit their crimes, they're going to do it anyways. The second thing they talk about is about, cases where crimes happen to you and you don't want to tell them. Like cases like personal abuse, like children or women who are being abused by their parents or husbands, right? But I want to note that particularly in these cases, trust never gets established because of psychological coercion that often occurs. The very same psychological coercion that prevents people from going to the police. Things like having feelings for your abusers, despite the fact that he comes home and beats you every single day, you still don't want to tell anyone because you care about them. At that point in time, at the point in time which you know, where if you talk to a priest, that person is going to turn your husband in, you're less likely to want to talk to them. But I want to know what the impact of this is, because I think they hide the psychological detriment it is to these victims and individuals to have their most prominent way of recourse and ability to give them the courage to do the right thing being denied from them because they are scared of talking to the priest. That's why choice is important, right? But the second thing they tell us is that but in the status quo, priests have a choice. So really there's no difference. I want to point out here that the status quo is that most priests probably won't turn you in unless it's a truly a horrible, devastating crime, right? I would propose that the vast majority, before I go.
Note that the cases that we are talking about in government are specifically these serious cases, right? Note that it won't be small crimes, which means that this relationship with your priest will exist because big crimes are not a prevalent thing in an individual's personal life.
The problem is that even though it's big crimes, I'm pretty sure a small-time criminal isn't going to go to a priest because of a chilling effect that occurs, right? Because you can't, as a criminal, you don't really differentiate lines like, you know what, I'm going to go to my priest and I'm going to only talk to them about the misdemeanors, but all the serious crimes I'm going to hide, right? No, what you do is that you corrupt the fundamental integrity of the religion itself by pulling them and compelling them by law to confess to the police, and that's what destroys trust. Back down to the idea of choice, right? But the most important thing about the lack of trust is that it blocks off any opportunity. So for the note that if outside government really cares about the very, very worst of crimes, right? Crimes like things like terrorism or things like murders that are most certainly going to happen. I think these are cases where priests may tell themselves it's justified to, if they find out about it, and the only way they're going to find out is if priests have a trusting relationship with those people inside their church. And these are the crimes that we're at the very least able to prevent, right? But secondly, I want to talk about why religious protection, and in these cases, I think it's most justified, right? And most priests are able to justify both to themselves and the community about why they turn them in. That's why the trust isn't breached in our paradigm. But let's talk about religion, right? I think it's important to note here about what role religion often serves in communities like this and what a chilling effect it has. No, because people often can't distinguish what a serious crime is and between what a small crime is, right? So imagine communities which are struggling under the rife of crime. Oftentimes the church is a pillar of trust in these communities and tries to lead them off onto a better path. But the only way this occurs if an avenue of trust is open. At the point at which people who are spiraling down the wrong road believe that they cannot go to religion because one day if they accidentally commit a crime or they choose to do a serious crime, that they will automatically be denied that avenue, then there's no reason for them to want to seek this kind of redress in the first place, right? That's why these people in these communities are often denied access to religion in its entirety. Right? But remember that Isaac told you that given the impact of religion, that importance that religion has on these people's lives, religion can help turn their lives around. And that's why it's so important to keep the door open and to prevent the church from being seen as distrustful and being, having the image of, being unable to separate between church and state. For all those reasons, because we want to protect victims, because we want to protect an avenue where people can release their stress and worries, and because priests must be the corner at people's backs. Proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for their comments, and now I'd like to call on the member of government to open the second half of the debate. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Madam Chair, we believe in this debate it is important to show the principal justification of why it is fair to impose that the policy in the first place. So that's what we're going to do in the closing government. First, we'll show principally why it would institute equality in front of the law, and secondly, how do we get rehabilitation on our side of the house as well. But before that, I want to make clear one thing, because the argumentation about victim, it seems to me irrelevant, because I think even if the priest would report on their side of the house that certain person was exposed to certain kind of serious crime, it is still up to victim to whether or not report that to the police or not. That's to say, so we don't think if victim didn't go to the police, in their world, it's unlikely to change, and that this victim would sue its perpetrators on their side of the house as well. So we don't think that's comparative to the extent that the opening opposition claims so. So the second thing that they say, that it will trust relationships for the ordinary people during the confession, we don't think that it's true as well. The people who do not committed any crime do not have any problems and any costs to go and confess if it is so important to them. So we don't think that's going to change. So turning to the constructive, why equality in front of the law? We believe in the status quo, equality in front of the law is undermined. Why? Because it is differential treatment of citizens. Why? Because for concealment of crime, ordinary citizens are punished in the status quo because it is a serious crime, and that's why you are actually punished in the status quo. But for the same thing, priests are not punished, and we believe it is unfair because both citizens, both are the citizens who have to obey the law equally. So why this fairness is important? We believe it is important because the state is for everyone, because everyone pays taxes, and everyone gave up its right to the state, for example, over the monopoly of violence. That means that state should treat everyone, because everyone actually is contributing to the extent or on the arranged terms that everyone democratically came to agree. And so we think it is actually principally unfair that priests do have such advantage, and we believe it is bad. Opening opposition to that says that that priests actually exist to protect spiritual body, just like the lawyer. We have two responses to that. Firstly, we don't think that lawyers are need for, we think that lawyers are there for the need of ensuring fair trial. I'm not sure why it is the same for the for priests who do have such kind of rights. I don't think that it is actually, it's not the same instrumental motivation that is there. We don't think it's the same. That means you cannot assert that it's extension of protection of physical body, whatever that means. So we don't think this is a plausible analogy in the first place. But the second response I want to make here is that religious freedom is not absolute. Why? Because we already restricted for the sake of the security of majority. For example, we forbid things like niqab, like the facial covering or Muslim facial covering while driving or in certain public places. Why? Because it increases the probability of car crash, because you may not see the car approaching to you, that it is also unsafe for the public transport. And secondly, you cannot identify the face of an individual who is under using the wheel, and you cannot, so police cannot see on the street or who is that person. So it is also some kind of a security concern on our side of the house. Similarly, we believe we can limit the religious freedom of individuals in this case as well, for the sake of the majority. Why? Because not reporting is actually decreases the security of individuals, and it is bad. Why? Security is more important than religious freedom. There are two reasons. Firstly, it concerns more people, not only the religious people who believe, but because everyone walks on the streets, everyone is actually lives outside and does something there. That means it potentially may harm more individuals, not just one. Second reason why it is more important, because security is precondition for any kind of liberty, any kind of freedom, including the religious freedom. Because if your streets are dangerous, if you're killed, you cannot practice religion, because simply you do not exist at this point. Or if you're severely injured or beaten, or you're too feared to go to the church, this is the same point where you cannot go to the church and practice your religious freedom. That means getting more security on our side of the house is important as well. But before I move on, I would like to take, opening a position.
Given that under your paradigm, confessing to a priest is tantamount, is equivalent to confessing to the police, why do you get any confessions under your side?
I'm not sure why actually if you're saying that certain individuals do go to that in order to actually say to confess and like get kind of relief, we don't think these people actually can be caught on our side of the house, and that means to a certain degree efficiency is remain. But that's not the main reason that we propose this motion. The main reason we propose this motion because in the status quo this is unequal in front of the law. That means we do have to fix that. The next point that we get from the opening opposition, that these individuals actually do need help because it would increase the probability of their rehabilitation. I'm not sure why this would they would interpret this in a way that would actually stop them committing a crime. I think the more plausible scenario where the interpretation would be that they can get away with doing such crimes because the priest was always would tell them that God would forgive them, and these individuals may go on committing more and more crimes. Notice the fact that opening opposition does not provide you reasons why exactly their scenario is possible. So at the very least, this response is actually equalizes us, and we don't think this is okay. Moreover, we think at the point when more perpetrators are actually more likely to get rehabilitation on our side of the house, because these individuals feel guilty on our side of the house because their conscience is not relieved through things like confession. That means they constantly feel that guilt, and they cannot turn to religion, and they may likely to actually improve their situation to a certain extent. That means if the individuals are concerned with committing a crime, or these individuals would gone to the priest on their side of the house, but now they're left on their own, so they have to deal with their problems. That means they may actually end up self-correcting themselves. That's why I'm very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for their comments, and now call on the member of opposition. Here.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Just a sec. Timer. Okay. So we'll present two main points here today. We'll first discuss the impact on minority religious groups, and then we'll discuss how there will be governmental abuse against the minorities. First of all, a quick point of rebuttal. We heard a lot about equality before the law. So we have to say that even today, in the status quo, a family member does not have to testify against one of his own closer family members. And why is that? The reason for that is because the government understands that we have to keep intact the whole family unit. We understand there's a special relationship. We understand it's very hard for a family member to testify or to go and tell the police what happened against one of the other family members, because as a government want to keep that special relationship and not create those kinds of very difficult conflicts. We just say that this kind of evidence, this kind of testimony is privileged, which means you don't have to go and tell it to the police or the government. So we believe that there is the same relationship between a priest and his community, and I will even elaborate on that point. First of all, I want to start and say that this motion isn't only about priests. We have to understand that rabbis, imams, and all kinds of different religious leaders are in this motion because we do not want to discriminate in those situations. And we have to understand that the special relationship and the special situations that you have with your religious community applies to all and not just Christianity. And this just apply to Christian priests and that's all. After that, we have to understand the importance of religious institutions and especially of those institutions to minorities. We have a lot of minorities, be it the United States, Europe, or all over the world. Religious institution is a point of meeting, a point of community, a point of society for many of those minorities. They can go there, meet, discuss, receive a lot of relief, have some kind of religious authority to comfort them in very hard times. We see it in the United States with the mosques, with different kind of religious groups, be it Polish Christians, Ukrainians, or different kinds of Jewish people from all over the world that come and meet in those religious institutions, which means this is a safe space for them. And this safe space creates the community for those minorities, for those immigrants, which is very important for them. So we have to understand how this situation will impact specifically the minority religious groups. First of all, we have to understand how this will requirement look. The moment that the police, the FBI, or whatever kind of government body has some kind of suspicions that maybe someone did commit some kind of crime, maybe they suspect some kind of terrorist activity or some kind of criminal activity that they disprove, you start seeing a lot of surveillances. You'll start seeing religious leaders being called into investigations or being called to testify in court, which means that this will create for most of the believers, most of those minority people that already feel threatened in those countries, already feel that they're not connected enough to this country, be it in Europe, the United States, they'll start feeling constantly under surveillance and constantly sort of people that can be being ordered to be in questions, which means that the safe space, the community space will stop feeling as a safe space, and people will start feeling unsafe in those places. This not now. This thing will turn a lot of those minority groups to go to more and more anti-establishment religious institutions, which means they won't go to their local church, mosque, or Bet Knesset, and they'll go to a more anti-establishments. The reason for that is that they will feel unsafe there. They'll go to more underground meetings. They'll just go to places that won't be seen as much in this. And this things already will bring the whole situation of the trust. Even more so, what this proposition brings is that the more radical people in all of those different religions will have more ammunition. They'll finally be able to say that, look, the government is surveilling us. The government is against us. What we've been saying all along, that we have to become more radical. We have to start doing more, being more cautious, more underground, start doing some activity that is not seen by the government and going against the government. They will have the ammunition to finally say that, yes, we were right, and you will have to join us. With the feeling that this situation is right, because the believers and the worshippers will feel that they're being under surveillance, they will decide that they will have to go to those more anti-establishment, more radical groups, which means that they'll turn away from the more mainstream community and religious places and go to the more radical ones, which is a problem by itself. Yes, opening government.
Note that we characterize that this would not be something that would happen every day. And note that also that specifically we are talking about very serious crimes. We're not talking about government having control over all of these religious institutions, right?
Of course, but at the moment the government has a suspicion that maybe, let's say, some Christian group is involved in some kind of terrorist things or activity, they'll put a surveillance. It's enough for me to hear just once a news story that says some of the churches, some of the mosques, some of the Jewish temples are being under surveillance or being suspicious, for me to understand, okay, maybe my specific church, my specific mosque isn't under surveillance right now, but it could be any situation, which means it's enough for me to understand that the government has the ability to do the surveillance, to write down my name somewhere or to follow me, just to understand that this could happen, and this will bring me to go to the more underground, more radical groups. Another very serious impact that it will have, that the government and the more moderate, more mainstream religious groups will stop collaborating all along, because those religious leaders, those religious groups will understand that working with the government is something that brings suspicions to my community and my people, and that's that's why working all together will be bad. Another very important point is governmental abuse. OG is saying that, well, it'd only be in the extreme cases, but we have to remember, Donald Trump specifically said that he doesn't want any Muslims in the United States whatsoever. So give this president, this person, enough power to just start calling in priests or imams, abusing it. Trump isn't the only example. We have Vladimir Putin that is just prosecuting any religious groups that aren't Russian Orthodox, which means that you have a lot of leaders today already prosecuting religious groups. Give them another power, another legal source of calling those people into investigations, surveilling those people, asking them questions and harassing them is just another very big opening for huge abuse that will be used by those leaders. So what we're giving to you is that this thing will first of all will be impacting the minorities in a very severe way and will create a mistrust and a turning point to go to more extremism. And another thing, there will be a huge abuse used by different leaders against minority religious groups. And this is why we're opposing this proposition. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speakers for their comments and now call on the government whip. You're here.
1 second. So two things. First, principal clash, and second, deterrence clash. But before that, closing opposition. So they talk about radicalization, two answers. First, we believe that there will be still some extent of the trust, and there will be understanding. Why? Because they have been going to this church from their childhood. They trust this priest. They know him, and therefore, most likely, they will understand that it's not like priest being bad, but it's like their obligation, and still they can participate to their church community things and go on Sundays, etc. They will still do those things because you still trust. But secondly, though, I think all those extremist groups can be regulated by the government, because I think government is quite successful to moderating it and regulating, because it's very dangerous to have all those extremist groups, given that nowadays, like, extremism is very important question of the security. I think government will actually invest in regulating that. However, if it's not so extremist, and even if it's underground, even if it's not harmful, I think there are no problems. But if it's harmful, it will be regulated, of course. So two things. Talking about principal clash. So what we talk about, like in closing government, is that we are against any discrimination. We're against any inequality. That's say we are against like family stuff that comes from the closing opposition, family confidentiality they talk about. We are against lawyer confidentiality that comes from opening opposition. Yes, what we stand for in closing government is probably in the reality there are many instances in which like there is confidentiality, but we are okay with banning all of them, and what we stand is the pure equality. Let's say comparing this principle with opening government. I think opening government's medicine staff principle isn't really clear. It's not really. They never clarify how this medicine principle is fundamental to human interaction and how this is really related. The same problem with opening opposition. Let's say lawyer analogy. Yes, it is well proven, but it's not enough to prove that in status quo there are like lawyer confidentialities, because in closing government we stand against those lawyer confidentialities, and we also stand for obliging those lawyers to opt out from this confidentiality. Let's say in comparison with all of those analogies, closing government like may firstly explain fundamental idea of equality. That's the, even if there are analogies in the state school, we explain how fundamentally discrimination is unjust and equality is the most important thing in any human interaction. That's the in any to achieve any right, this equality and the security should be fundamental. And note, this is independent from any analogies that are given from the opposition side but never proven. No question. Therefore, I think that closing government makes better job in explaining how those principles work and why this principle is the most important one. Second, let's talk about deterrence effect. No question. So what we explain in closing government is that religious confessions allow criminals to be rather approved than rehabilitated. Let's say usually you as a criminal free to interpret what priests have said. Let's say given that criminals are in most cases psychologically unstable, they are more likely to interpret this religious priest as him as approving those crimes. Let's say you are giving your sorry, and therefore you can't actually start from the newspaper and make more crimes. I think this directly clashes with opening opposition's case about rehabilitation. Here, I think why closing government still wins opening opposition, because on opening opposition never proves to you uniqueness of confession. That's to say, I think you as a religious criminal still can go to the church. Let's say you still can participate in those community things. You still can go and talk to priests on Sundays, but it's not like, but probably you won't tell your crimes and you will not confess, but you still can participate in religious life. You still can chat with other religious community, and therefore you still can be rehabilitated. Why is it true? One, because given that you need this religion so much, and given that both opening tables prove that religion is basic for you, and you need this, it means you probably respect religion and probably will go to church anyways, and will understand that the responsibility is on the state but not on you. But secondly, though, you understand that you are free. Actually, you trust to the church because nobody will catch you, nobody will see you, because like the only thing for you is not to tell that you have done crimes, but you still can go as a normal person and still can participate. The state opening opposition fails to explain uniqueness of confessions and why confessions are the most important thing in order to be rehabilitated. However, in comparison in closing government, we as closing government prove to you why all those confessions are key for criminals to continue their crimes, are key and unique for criminals to continue their crimes. However, alternatively, they could feel sinful, they could actually feel all of those stuff, and they could fear, and therefore I think on outside of the house there could be much less crime. So let's compare this point with opening government's practical impact. Let's say opening government claims we will have less crimes because there will be more police investigation. Note, as closing opposition already talked, priests are allowed to tell the police in both worlds. Let's say if a priest has a victim telling and asking for help, probably priests will do it in both worlds because priests feel some responsibility. However, if victim is unwilling to talk, like is unwilling to talk to the police in both worlds, victim will refuse cooperation, will not give police information, and therefore criminals will not be catched in both worlds. I think therefore we believe that practical impacts given by opening government are very, very limited because they either happen on both worlds or do not happen at all. However, on our side of the house, in closing government, we explain to you why there will be more crimes. That's say this is the thing that won't happen in both worlds because we already proved to in comparison with opening opposition and in comparison with opening government why is much more likely to happen and why it's bad. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their comments and now call on the opposition whip to conclude the debate. Here.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so two clashes in this debate. First clash, how this motion will affect most of the believers, and second of all, a more principal clash on not even that principle, but like the mitigation between security and freedom of religion, and on which side we will have more infringement on those rights, something like that on the principle level. Before that, 3 points of rebuttal. So let's go directly to the first point where I want to rebut CG's rebuttal to us. So what they're telling us is basically that people won't go to different churches, won't go to more extreme or underground places because, and they will stay on their own churches because they know them from when they were young. They trust the priest, they trust their priests, etc. Well, basically know that this is why they are not leaving their place today. This is why they are staying on those churches today, because they were going there since they were young, because they are trusting their priests not to go to the police and say something about them. But tomorrow their priests are obligated to do that. Tomorrow the police or the state has the opportunity to call those priests from like the Afro-American churches or from other sorts of religions to testify. to testify every other Monday on some sort of crime, to testify whether someone from their community confessed on committing those crimes. And we are talking for specifically of communities where there are higher crime rates, and this is in response to OG's POI. It means that there are more people suspected of crimes from those communities, suspected of severe crimes as well. And it means that it is much more probable that the police will actually, or the state will abuse their power and call on those priests to testify, summon them to court, summon them to police station. And the people from the communities will see the priests, will see physically the priests going there and will know that they'll go there, and hence this is how the trust level will become less, and this is why they will go to other places. Second point of rebuttal, not that CG are telling us that, well, if there are other churches that are extreme or stuff like this, that those churches are outlawed, they are not existing, they won't exist tomorrow. Well, this is simply a very naive rebuttal. I mean, we are seeing that there's more extreme religious places coming all over the world. There are a rise of the right wings in Europe, and with them there is a rise in religion. There is a rise in extreme religious places, both in Christianity and in other religion. Hence, we're thinking that they're simply not being nuanced enough. Now, let's rebut last point of rebuttal to OG, because OG have this impact on the second speech about why it is important for the priests to do the motion, because otherwise there's someone who is innocent will sit in jail, and someone who is innocent will be accused, and this is why they have to testify. So 2 points of rebuttal on this. First of all, note that we can't expect the priests to actually take this sort of account into their mind or do this responsibility on them, because they don't have the knowledge of whether is there somebody else accused or not. But once you don't have the knowledge or the information, it means that the responsibility is not on you. Now, who's this responsibility on? The responsibility is on the legal system to do their process correctly, to do the process justly, and it doesn't mean that you need to shift this responsibility to the communities and do this motion on them. Now let's go inside the clash. What we're telling you, let's talk about the first clash, about how let's talk about the first clash, about how this motion will affect believers tomorrow. So note that what we're getting from the first half of this debate is this discussion about whether believers will trust their priests or not, whether they will leave the churches or not. We're saying that our analysis fits exactly on the optimum point in this discussion, because we explained to you that of course they will not abandon their religion. They will still want this someone like a priest to confess to. They will still want some sort of religious community and stuff like this, because it's important as both sides agree upon. What we're telling you is what those believers will do. Those believers will seek places that are specifically, where priests are specifically going against the government, where priests are specifically preaching against the establishment today, because those are the places where it's much more plausible that the priests will break the law and not testify in you, because these were the places where the priests are already saying that they are not cooperating with the system, that they are not willing to go with the government. And this is the places where that Eddie, my partner, is talking about, the underground establishments, the more extreme churches, the ones were more extreme, so were more populist and extreme kind of like extreme crime. People who commit crime. No, thank you. People who commit crime are already going today, and we think it's much more plausible that people won't leave their churches entirely, but seek other places, and these are the places that will be available for them. Now, from this point, look on all the impacts that Eddie gives you. Eddie explains to you why this will be an ammunition for those places to actually become to actually turn even the more no, sorry, it's over, to turn even the more like not extreme believers to more extreme points. This is where you will show them that yes, we are being prosecuted by the government. Yes, look, look, the government isn't supporting our religion, and etc. Now let's quickly engage with the second clash, because note what we are getting on the principal clash. We're getting basically this discussion whether it's of security, religion, and where is the optimum point. What we're saying to you is that our case explains to you on a larger level where on a larger level why there will be a less secure world tomorrow for most of the population, both on terms of engaging with different sorts of religious and being of religions, but because note that in Judaism you have to consult your rabbi when you're getting a moral decision. In Islam, you have the fatwa, which is a legal opinion on Islamic law that you have to get when you encounter those sorts of crimes. And hence, we explain to you on a larger scale where most of the population will be affected. We are very proud to oppose.
Thank the speakers for their comments and everyone for a really enjoyable debate. If I'm giving an oral adjudication, I might just take 5 to 10 minutes and come back with it then, if that's okay. So I'm just going to mute my microphone and then I'll have feedback really shortly, if that's okay. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Give feedback. Is everyone here able to hear, etc.?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, cool. I am just gonna go ahead then. Okay, thanks everyone for a really enjoyable debate. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give the call and then I'm going to go through the teams in the order that the debate happened, and then if you have any specific questions I can deal with them for the group, or if you want to talk to me separately, I think that's probably fine too, not to keep everyone together. If you want to message me or whatever, that should be okay. The call that I came to was to give the first to the team in opening government, the second to the team in closing government, the third to the team in closing opposition, and the fourth to the team in opening opposition. So I'm just going to go through the arguments as the debate happened and explain the reason for why I came to that decision. So starting with the things that we get from opening government, I think there are 3 things that opening government largely or broadly give us. The first is that they give a characterization that, and this is in the first speech and clearer in the second speech, but I think a starting point of their argument, that when you have a law that legally requires crimes to be reported or incidents to be reported, you are more likely to have those crimes or incidents reported. So the idea that, and we get a few reasons for that. So for example, that at the moment when there is an illegal position on it, it's less likely to happen, and that because at the moment the position of the church or religion or whatever might be that you wouldn't report, and also that it's just not enough for priests to have a choice, but rather it should be something that's required because that's just something that's more likely to compel them. So we get that comparison that's like, okay, so now it's more likely to happen in general. And I think that's something that is broadly accepted in the debate as a position, is that in general priests are going to tell a higher percentage of the confessions that they hear. That's not really largely contested in the debate in terms of as a premise. And the second thing that they talk to us about is who are the people that are confessing and what are the stories that are therefore likely to be reported. So they kind of give us this characterization that it's not hardened criminals, that it's not even necessarily like criminals that are in any way like malicious or whatever, but also that it's more likely to be victims, and it's more likely to be people who were part of the crime in some capacity but aren't necessarily the perpetrators of the crime. And I think that is an important thing in the debate in terms of dealing with so a lot of the arguments that come later are in relation to like, oh, if you committed a crime, would you or wouldn't you go to confession? And I think that to a degree that is ignored in terms of the framing that that opening government gives us, is that it's not people who necessarily want to hide what they've done or want to hide what's happened, and they're the people that are you're more likely to report on crimes in general. So they talk about victims, and the reason why they say that's important is because they say that in general you are more likely to have, therefore, the stories of victims being reported, and you are more likely to have things like innocent people's names being cleared or families of victims getting respite. So they kind of give us three benefits that come as a result of, firstly, more crimes in general being told of when they've been told to a priest in the confessional, and secondly, the idea that therefore you get these three sets of results. You get people whose stories would never have been told to the police being told to the police, you get a possibility of more people's names being cleared, and also you get a possibility of victims hearing what really happened to them or what really happened to their family member who was a victim or whatever it might be. There are some things that reduce, I think, the impact of this in terms of what we hear in the debate. So, for example, there's some mitigatory material coming from opening opposition, where they say, oh, well, people can tell those stories about victims anyway. They say that, closing government also say, kind of in mitigating opening government's argument, that, well, there's no point because the victim can't sue or whatever the case might be. I think that those arguments generally do reduce the impact of opening government's claim, but I think that there are, to a degree, that claim still stands, because they don't eliminate it. So, for example, where opening government has given the analysis that says, well, at the moment there isn't a legal obligation, so people aren't making the choice to say, well, they could choose to tell the stories of victims at the moment, or they could choose to come forward and clear an innocent person's name, or they could choose to come forward and tell families what really happened, or tell victims what really happened to them, doesn't say that they do that at the moment. And opening government's argument is that legal requirements make it more likely that people will do that, because at the moment religious requirements require the opposite. Similarly, the argument that, oh, well, victims mightn't take a case, that doesn't necessarily do enough to prove that impact isn't necessarily true. So, for example, yes, maybe victims do have to take a case, but maybe they'd be more likely to do that if a priest had already gone to the police and reported it, and the police were interviewing you about it, or something along those lines. So while those things do reduce the impact, there are clear impacts that are happening and that mightn't otherwise happen. And I don't think they rely on any analysis about hardened criminals, mafia, or even necessarily criminals themselves coming forward. I think that they can rely on other aspects of what you might be told in a confessional by a victim or by someone who was party to the crime. And then the third thing that they do is they talk about how what you need is for people to be caught, because then society is protected. I think this is possibly one of the least mechanized or pulled out parts of their case, and so it becomes a bit more difficult at that point to recognize, where I think this is a reach for a long-term or widespread impact that doesn't necessarily accrue. So I think that there could have been more analysis put into that, but in general, I do buy that there are reasons at the moment why priests are not reporting crimes that could otherwise be reported and that could otherwise change people's lives or change how justice is administered, and that is important. I think that there was more of a need to expand on what the larger societal systemic changes and that might occur as a result of this motion might be from opening government. I didn't think that was done thoroughly enough. And then the final thing that we hear, and I think this is it's kind of more of a sub point from opening government, but somewhat relevant, I think, in how the debate, I ended up considering how the debate worked, was kind of this idea of oh, well, should priests be even making these decisions? This argument, not just that the choice versus requirement analysis means that you get more reports, but also why is there a choice when there could be a requirement that would lead to this, and should priests be making the decisions that can save or change people's lives, was kind of came in the second speech to a smaller degree at the end, but I'll tag that back in later in terms of considering how the bench worked. So then moving on to opening opposition, there are, I think, three main tenets of opening. No, there are four main things. So the first of all is in relation to what opening opposition frame this debate about. So they say, no, realistically, yes, this debate is not about hardened criminals, but it is about once-off criminals who will confess, and on our side will confess and will get guidance from a priest to go to the police, and on your side won't confess at all. I think that it's plausible that there are a group of people who are one-off criminals who are likely to go to a priest in the case compared to hardened criminals. But I think this doesn't really deal with the analysis that we get from opening up government about other people who would have information on serious crimes that the priests could then report to the police, because the debate isn't just about, like, I guess, a convenient group of people who might report a serious crime, but just anybody who could tell a priest about a serious crime in a confessional. And I think that by, I guess, trying to like focus on that solely, and then I think it's kind of patched up a little bit in rebuttal as the speeches go on as to why it wouldn't be other people. But I think that a lot of that rebuttal is mitigatory, like saying, oh, well, people are brainwashed and they're afraid of their spouses or significant others, doesn't mean that it might necessarily come out in a confessional that somebody had been harmed or injured. And I think that while it is true that it could mean that is unlikely to happen, it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. And so it does. I don't think it can be ruled out of the debate in the same way that opening opposition tries to conclusively do. So they talk about one-off criminals, and basically the argument from opening opposition is that those people do not confess anymore because they don't trust the police. Sorry, they don't trust priests, and at the moment they also don't trust the police, so they don't confess at all, or largely that is what the kind of economic or socio-political or whatever analysis that we get from opening opposition in relation to that. I think that the biggest difficulty that I have in processing this argument is in relation to what opening government's response is, where they say, well, at the moment, if priests do have a choice to tell the police, then why do people trust the priests in the first place? And I think that there are responses to this, but I don't think that opening opposition necessarily gives a conclusive enough response to this. And so there's kind of a thing of, oh, well, if they trust them, then it'll be okay. But it's not entirely clear why that benefit accrues on opposition side of the house. So I think that in general, it's not necessarily clear that there is a huge amount of people who are one-off criminals who are no longer confessing to priests because they are legally required, and especially given the context of the debate where there is examples and questions posed as to whether even some priests would adhere to the law or whatever it might be. It isn't necessarily clear that if your average priest can go to the police, why you would think that you wouldn't be the person that they would go to the police on. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. But basically, it becomes quite difficult to weigh, and especially in the context of a top half debate that is realistically about a larger group of people. It's not entirely clear that those are the people that are the most important people to catch, or that they're most likely to be reported in the first place. And I think that is a problem that happens in the debate in general, is that what a lot of teams do is they find a group that proves their case particularly well, and they really well analyze how those people might interact with priests, with the law, whatever it might be, but they don't necessarily explain why, comparatively speaking, that means that it is more important that this law is, or requirement is or isn't introduced. The second thing that opening opposition bring us is in relation to how worse crime occurs, so how there's less rehabilitation, how there's no catharsis, how people are less likely to participate in church. I think that this analysis, and it becomes more apparent in the context of closing government's responses to this analysis, requires more in relation to like why specifically confession or confessional, or what you say to a priest dictates your relationship with a religion, or dictates how you might feel about that particular religion or that particular religious community, especially if you're somebody who, which the opening and opposition analysis says, your community or your priest or your church is the pillar, the standpoint, the place where you go, the place where everything happens. It's not entirely clear to me why you couldn't just leave things out of confession, as opposed to why you would feel like you'd been shunned by your church or whatever else it might be. And I know that that's obviously to a degree reading things in that hadn't happened at that point that you couldn't engage with. I think it is a response that we hear in closing government, but I do think that is like a realistic perspective of I guess how the debate happens. And I'm also not entirely sure why that is a harm that has to happen, or why the opposite is true. Like, it's not entirely clear to me that if you went to a confessional, that would be better for you, or that not going to a confessional would make you a hardened criminal, or what the probabilities of those things are. And I think that possibly it's just a little bit far reaching in terms of the relative and realistic I guess, depictions that we have in the debate in terms of who goes to a confessional, who's talking to a priest, what are they likely to say to the priest, what's the priest likely to say to them, and that those people are more likely to be people who are not in any way in a huge amount of danger or likely to be reported to the police, but rather people who have information that would be relevant to the police, to investigations of crimes, but not necessarily to them, the criminal themselves, if that makes sense. And then the final thing is in relation to, and I think this is a point that possibly, I think, maybe just reached for the wrong thing, but it was in a good area. And this was about specifically like protecting a spirit, or why religion is particularly important and why that needs to be protected. And I think that the analysis that you give, comparing this to legal privilege or lawyers, is interesting, but I think it is missing a few things. The first is an explanation of why that is particularly important. So why is the spiritual as important as the physical? And I think there are lots of reasons why that's true. And I think it is true that in general, religion does enjoy an elevated status in society because it's viewed as a really important part of people's identity. But the second thing in relation to this is I think what open government, a response to open government give, which is that by still accepting or hearing confessions, priests are still able to protect people's spirits. So I think that your analysis in relation to the importance of protecting a spirit needed a step forward, or a step more, in terms of explaining why, if priests can hear a confession, and then if it contains a serious crime, they have to report it to the police. But presumably they can also absolve you of any spiritual wrongdoing in that process. And so I think a little bit more of how that process steps out in terms of what in particular you need to protect about spiritual, what part of spiritual well-being needs to be protected, to what degree it needs to be protected, and why that's important and why that's true, because I think that possibly just kind of got lost then in the debate as it went on, in terms of its significance, or its significance in democratic society, but just its significance in general when it comes to, I guess, legislation or rulemaking or whatever. And because that protection doesn't seem to as large as the protection of people who have gone to priests with information, and because priests had a tendency to keep that information to themselves because of their religious beliefs and because they had no legal requirements, justice wasn't done in those situations, if that makes sense. So where that weighing up seems to happen, it doesn't I don't think it weighs as heavily as it could have, and I think there was probably more analysis that could have been done to explain why that was particularly significant. Okay, so moving on then to closing government. So closing government bring two main branches of argument. The first is in relation to just the principal idea that this discrimination is unjust, and that this exception should not apply to priests where it would otherwise be a crime for people to keep these secrets to themselves. I think that this is catching on to the tails of what opening government talk about when they talk about how this is not a choice the priests should be able to make, and that they don't know the impacts of it, so they shouldn't be allowed to make it, and particularly in relation to, and I know this is this analysis when they give it is a response to opening opposition, but particularly in relation to whether innocent people end up taking the rap in jail or not, or whether families find out the truth of what happened to them, or whatever the case might be. I think the reason why I felt that this argument in itself was new, but actually what happened was the impacts of it, or the explanation of it, became somewhat similar. So even though it was a different explanation to opening government for why the requirement should be in place, I think it ended up being the same in terms of the impacts that were analysed. So this idea that, oh, well, it could save several lives, or the physical well-being of people should come before the spiritual well-being. I mean, I don't think these are fleshed out enough in member or in whip, and I think that they are similar to things that we hear from opening government in terms of what the end goal should be, or what the impact of the principle that they've explained is. And so I think that while there could have been more, I feel like there could have been more done to explain why specifically in relation to equality, in relation to separation of church and state, in relation to elevating clerics, this is wrong. I think that wasn't necessarily dragged out to the same degree that it could have been, and I think that that's where closing government possibly don't go far enough to give an extension that I guess has new weight to it, or has new I guess impacts, for lack of a better word, or a new mechanism. And then secondly, they talk about kind of the general practical impact, so how it would affect people's relationship with their faith. And they talk about how, well, people actually, what all this does is absolves people, so it doesn't stop them from committing crimes in future, and they're still likely to participate in their church. And I think that those are things that are important in terms of explaining why opening opposition's analysis about rehab is incorrect. But I think that opening government's arguments as to why those people are just not likely to be the people who are confessing to priests, i.e. the priests have a choice at the moment whether or not to report on the members of their church, and the fact that people have generally accepted that hardened criminals aren't the I guess end goal of the debate, means that it does enough to, I think, knock out opening opposition's arguments, but I don't think it does enough by way of extending on new new important material to come above opening government's case. And then dealing finally with closing opposition's case. So I think that closing opposition, I think the closing opposition do something similar to opening opposition, or make a mistake that's somewhat similar, in that while it makes sense to focus on a specific group, I think there just isn't enough comparative analysis in the arguments for it to necessarily come above and win the debate outright. So in general, the thing that is clear at the end of closing opposition's argument is that this is an avenue that is likely to, in some situations, result in discrimination that's generally wrong and will, I guess, make lives worse for people, particularly in minority communities. So you give us two main, I think, branches of analysis. The first is in relation to creating distrust of clerics, and also of the way that this is used in minority religions and how that affects how people engage with that minority religion. And so increasing surveillance means that you break down or attack hubs of community that mean that people are more likely to be radicalized, less likely to be in touch with their that hub of their community, and less likely to be in touch with their priest or with their religious leader. I think this argument is good. I think that the thing that it possibly misses, which isn't, I think, as attacked as much as it could have been in the debate, but just something that makes it, I guess, makes it clear what the mutual exclusivity of this is. So what is the difference between, so if we, for example, accepted the fact that this policy will mean that people are not likely to confess when they have committed serious crimes anymore, but they're still likely to participate in their church, what is the impact of your particular argument? What is the impact of that, accepting that fact, on your particular argument? I think that it possibly just doesn't do enough to engage with the debate as it's developed. And so where opening government and closing government say, no, this is not about, because you have nothing to fear, presumably, if you haven't committed a crime. So why do those people move to different churches? And why isn't surveillance just generally accepted when all this law does, or doesn't generally happen, when all this law does is allow you to take information from confessions of people? So it's not entirely clear that those things wouldn't in some way happen in other capacities. And I think that's where, I think just that failure to, I guess, wrap that argument around to the point where it applies to newer situations, or it applies to the arguments that opening government and closing government are talking about. So like broader information that priests have that they shouldn't have for reasons that opening government and closing government tell you. I think that just needs a bit more analysis in terms of explaining why that might be the case. And then I think the second thing that you talk about in relation to how there's a breakdown in terms of governments, so governments becoming more extremist, and also these religious communities stopping to cooperate with governments. I actually think that there could have just been more analysis of the impacts there. So I think you reached quite quickly towards radicalization when you actually could have reached for more maybe closer to home, tangible, more widespread impact. So what happens when a community hub is no longer a place where a community congregates? I don't know, more likely to have antisocial behavior, less likely to know your neighbors, less likely to be safe, more likely to XYZ. So I think that there possibly could have been more there in terms of I guess like bigger, more widely applicable impacts that were just a little bit closer to home and might have made that argument seem more significant or more relevant. And because the reaching for the radical extremist elements of that argument, I think, ignored the more nuanced claims of opening government and closing government about who actually would be affected by this debate. And I think that made it more difficult for that to seem generally impactful. I think in comparing the arguments that are heard from opening opposition and closing opposition, so the main crux of opening opposition's case is that this provides more opportunities to deal with some crimes. So whether that be because you're able to get those people to confess and then go to the police, and they wouldn't actually do that now, or you're able to, when it's really, really, really bad, you're able to justify the fact that you went to the police. I think that a lot of these arguments hinge on what is, up to that point, I think seemed an unrealistic claim in the debate in terms of who actually does confess things to priests and what priests hear in confessionals, and how the people who confess to them are likely to feel about whether they'll go to the police, or how comfortable they are them having that information. I think in comparison, the arguments that closing opposition make about how this particular tool can be used to take something that people previously thought was private, or something that was protected because it was recognized as being important, and make communities who are likely to be minority communities feel attacked, feel surveilled, feel like their privacy has been violated, and how those things can have ramifications in terms of how those communities feel and are treated, but also how they react. I think that has more broadly, widely applicable impacts in general, and that was basically the reason why I felt that closing opposition took it over opening opposition. I realized that was quite a long adjudication, but if you have any questions for everyone to hear, I'm happy to take them out, or if you have any questions for me specifically, please do contact me, and that would be great. But thanks very much, guys. I really enjoyed the debate.